Alejandro adjusted his silk tie while looking at his reflection in the office mirror. The villa was bustling with activity, and the staff hurried to complete the preparations. Tonight's event would be unforgettable, not only because it would mark his commitment to Valeria, but because a very special guest had confirmed her presence, Sofia, his ex-wife. Persuading her to come had been a game of manipulation. In his message to her, Alexander deliberately omitted the fact that it was an engagement. He simply mentioned that it was an important evening to celebrate new ways of life. He knew that Sofia would not reject the invitation. Her curiosity and sense of etiquette had always been qualities he admired, and now he would use them to his advantage. Alejandro approached the window and looked out over the extensive gardens of the mansion. Valeria's arrival interrupted his thoughts. "Alejandro, honey, have you confirmed the guest list yet?" she asked as she walked in, her silk dress billowing behind her. "I want everything to be perfect, including the tables." "Yes, Valeria. Don't worry. I've already taken care of everything, even the surprise of the evening." Alejandro smiled, an enigmatic smile that did not go unnoticed by his fiancée. Valeria raised an eyebrow in fascination. "What a surprise. Let's say we will have an unexpected presence. Sofia will be here." Valeria's reaction was immediate. "Your ex-wife? Why did you invite her?" Alejandro shrugged his shoulders, feigning indifference. "It's part of my past, and I thought it would be polite to include it. Plus, I thought it would be interesting." Valeria smiled, although visibly uncomfortable. "Interesting, definitely. Well, as long as you know where you stand." When Valeria emerged to supervise the final preparations, Alejandro felt a mixture of fear and satisfaction. This would be his chance to show Sofia how much he had improved since the divorce. Deep down, he wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she was on top, something she never thought possible during her marriage. Across town, Sofia looked at the invitation on the kitchen table. The doubt in his eyes reflected the internal conflict he felt. "Why would Alejandro invite me to something like that?" he murmured, while his sister Clara put 2 cups of coffee on the table. "I told you this smells like a trap," Clara commented, crossing her arms. "He never does anything without an ulterior motive. Are you sure you want to go?" Sofia sighed and ran her fingers along the edge of the invitation. "Yes, I'm leaving. Not because I expect anything from him, but because I need to prove to myself that I'm over it." Clara shook her head reluctantly. "Just be careful. Men like Alejandro do not change." Later that night, as Sofia prepared herself in front of the mirror, she promised to stay calm. Wearing an elegant but simple black dress, she stared at herself and said in a low voice, "This is not for him. It is for me." When he arrived at the villa, the hustle and bustle and lights of the party filled the air. Luxury cars decorated the entrance, and the murmur of conversations mixed with the quiet clinking of champagne glasses. Sofia got out of the taxi with a firm step and her heart racing. This would be a night neither of them would forget. The mansion shined with overwhelming luxury. Hanging lights illuminated the stone arches, while the gardens looked like a living tableau with fountains and exotic flowers. Sofia walked down the main hallway with a firm step, although her thoughts were like a whirlwind. Despite the years, the familiarity of the surroundings left a knot in his stomach. This was Alejandro's world, a world she had left behind. A servant in an impeccable suit opened the front door for him. "Welcome, Miss Sofia," he said with a polite smile. She nodded and took a step inside. The noise of conversations and the clinking of glasses surrounded them. He took a deep breath, corrected his posture, and walked towards the main hall. It didn't take long to find it. Alejandro was at the foot of the grand staircase, surrounded by a group of guests. His perfectly fitting dark grey suit underlined his impressive appearance. He seemed to be the center of attention, as always. But what caught Sofia's attention was not him, but the woman who was next to him, Valeria. "Sofia!" Alejandro's voice cut through the hustle and bustle of the room. Several heads turned towards her. He left the group with a smile she knew very well, that mix of confidence and smugness. He walked towards her with his gaze fixed, studying her as if he were playing a game that only he understood. "Sofia, it's good to see you. I'm glad you came." His tone was warm, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words. Sophia maintained her composure. "Thank you for the invitation, Alejandro. Looks like it was a pretty busy night." "That's all. But this night wouldn't be complete without your presence." He held out his hand to Valeria, who approached him with a perfectly rehearsed smile. "Let me introduce you. This is Valeria, my fiancée." The weight of the word fell in the air between them like a stone. For a moment, Sophia felt like the world stopped. So that was it. That was the real reason for the invitation, but he didn't let his feelings show on his face. Instead, she smiled. A small smile, but enough to show that she didn't feel affected. "Nice to meet you, Valeria," he said, extending his hand. Valeria's gaze was appraising, as if searching for a weakness within her. "I've heard a lot about you," Valeria responded with a gentleness that was difficult to hide. "I just hope for the best," Sophia responded, staying calm. Alejandro watched them and clearly enjoyed the interaction. "Valeria was looking forward to meeting you. I told him a lot about our past, about the challenges we faced together." Sophia looked him straight in the eyes. "Well, challenges show us who we really are in an interesting way, don't they?" Before Alejandro could respond, a waiter approached him with a tray full of champagne glasses. Sophia took one and nodded politely. "I hope you have a wonderful evening," he said before addressing the crowd. As he walked away, Alejandro saw his figure disappear among the guests. Something about his behavior bothered him. He had expected her to feel uncomfortable, even vulnerable, but Sophia had remained firm. For a moment he doubted his plan. Valeria narrowed her eyes at him. "So this is your famous ex-wife?" "That's right," Alejandro responded, although his voice lacked the confidence it had had moments before. Sophia joined a small group of guests near the terrace, where the city lights shined in the distance. One of them was Mr. Mendoza, a renowned philanthropist. "Miss Sophia, right? I have heard about you and your work in rural communities. It's fascinating what you've accomplished." She smiled, grateful for the conversation. "I do what I can. I firmly believe that change starts from the grassroots." As he spoke, Alejandro watched them from a distance. Every word Sophia said, every movement seemed to attract more of the guests' attention. He felt his grip on the narrative of the night beginning to break. But that was just the beginning. The night was far from over. From the terrace, Sophia could feel the eyes on her. Alejandro wasn't the only one watching her, but that didn't intimidate her. With every word he said about his work at the church, he felt more in control. The evening, which had begun as a game for Alejandro, now seemed to be working against him, although he still did not accept it. In the living room, Valeria squeezed Alejandro's arm. "Are you going to let it shine like that?" "It's your night, our night." His tone was sharp, a clear attempt to regain concentration. But Alexander did not react immediately. Something inside him changed. Seeing Sophia so confident reminded him of the woman he had loved and underestimated. "Leave it, Valeria. There's nothing to worry about," he finally murmured. Although his words were reassuring, his gaze remained focused on Sophia. Valeria, dissatisfied, walked towards the terrace, determined to confront the woman who had, inadvertently, become the center of attention. "Sophia, darling," he began with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you are working on rural projects. It must be very rewarding, although I imagine it would be exhausting." Sophia maintained her firm stance and calm tone. "That's all, but it's worth every effort. Watching kids learn and grow is incomparable." Valeria tilted her head, feigning interest. "How inspiring. Although of course it must be difficult to reconcile everything with events like this, right?" The intention behind his words was obvious, but Sophia was not swayed. "Balance comes from prioritizing what is really important," he responded calmly. "And in my case, it is an investment in the future." Mr. Mendoza, still standing next to them, intervened with a smile. "Sophia is right. For investing in the future is something we should all do more of. Alejandro, we could learn something from this." Alejandro, who had just joined the group, felt the weight of the statement. Mendoza hadn't meant any harm, but her words hit him like a reminder of everything he had left behind. However, he couldn't allow himself to show weakness. Not tonight. "Of course, Mendoza. I'm always willing to learn," he responded with a controlled smile before turning to Sophia. "And it seems that you are still an excellent teacher in this context." Sophia looked at him directly, without any hint of nervousness. Some lessons are easier to teach than to learn, Alejandro. His words sounded unexpectedly heavy, and the group fell silent for a moment. Valeria was visibly uncomfortable and took Alejandro's arm. "Honey, I think we should say hello to the other guests. We don't want anyone to feel abandoned." Without waiting for a response, she dragged him back to the main hall. As they walked away, Alejandro took one last look at Sophia. What he had planned as a night to humiliate her took a turn he couldn't control. Sophia was not the defeated woman he had imagined. He had a dignity that exceeded all his expectations and that bothered him more than he wanted to admit. On the terrace, Mendoza smiled at Sophia. "It's comforting to see someone like you in this circle. We often forget what really matters." "It's easy to lose sight of what's important when you're surrounded by everything," Sophia responded, pointing out the luxury that surrounded her. "But some of us are learning not to depend on it." The evening continued, and Sophia decided to move among the guests, feeling that each conversation was an opportunity to reaffirm her place, not only in this event, but in her own history. The strength he had accumulated through years of hard work was evident in every word and every look. Meanwhile, in the middle of the room, Alejandro couldn't ignore how the guests were talking about Sophia. "I overheard snippets of conversations. It's amazing what he's done, a real inspiration." For the first time in years, Alejandro felt like he was losing control of his surroundings, and the feeling consumed him. Valeria was aware of his discomfort and tried to distract him. "What's wrong, Alexander? Are you still worried about your ex-wife? She is just a teacher. At the end of the day, this is our world, not yours." But Alexander did not answer. His mind was in another place, in another time. He remembered the days when he and Sophia dreamed of changing the world together. Now she seemed to be fulfilling those dreams, while he was caught in a web of apparitions. The atmosphere in the room was full of laughter and toasts, but Alejandro felt that the event itself went beyond what he had planned. And that scared him. Soft music and the clinking of glasses continued to fill the room, but Alejandro couldn't silence his thoughts due to the background noise. Every time he saw Sophia interacting with the guests, something inside him slowly broke. It wasn't just the attention he received, but also the way his narrative had changed. He had intended to humiliate her, but now it was she who, without apparent effort, showed an elegance and authenticity that contrasted with her own world of superficiality. In a corner of the room, Valeria, angry at Sophia's effect on the guests, looked for Alejandro. She found him standing with a group of colleagues, but the expression on his face revealed that his thoughts were elsewhere. "Alejandro," she said in a sweet but tense voice, "we have to talk." He nodded and followed her to a secluded corner. "What's the matter?" Valeria looked at him and crossed her arms. "Your ex-wife is stealing the spotlight from our evening. This was done to celebrate our commitment, not to make it shine." Alejandro took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. "Sophia does nothing but be herself. It's not her fault that people want to talk to her." Valeria looked at him in disbelief. "Are you really defending her? That was your idea, Alejandro. Bring them here, put them in their place. But now it seems like you are the one who is losing control." Valeria's words echoed in his head. For the first time, Alexander realized that the plan he had come up with no longer made sense. It wasn't Sophia who got caught up in her game, it was himself. Meanwhile, Sophia continued chatting with Mr. Mendoza and other guests on the terrace. His stories about projects in rural communities fascinated everyone. She did not speak with pretension, but with a genuine passion that moved those who heard her. "What you are doing is admirable," Mendoza commented. "Not many have the courage to work where it is really necessary." "It's a collective effort," Sophia responded. "I think there is something we can all do, no matter how small, to make a difference." At that moment, one of Valeria's friends, a woman with a haughty demeanor and a critical smile, approached the group. "Sophia, right?" he began in a tone full of false politeness. "Valeria mentioned your work to me. It must be exhausting." Sophia remained calm. "It is, but it's also rewarding." The woman raised an eyebrow. "I can't imagine how you manage to combine something so demanding with events like this. I guess you're not used to such an environment." Sophia smiled calmly. "What matters is not the environment. but how you present yourself. True elegance does not need a stage. The comment left the woman speechless, while the others in the group hid smiles. Mendoza added admiringly, "Sophia, you should give lectures on leadership. A lot of people here could learn from you." Alejandro watched the scene from a corner of the room. He was impressed by the way Sophia handled the advances and earned the respect of others. He didn't need jewelry or luxury to stand out. His authenticity was enough. Valeria, who had been observing the interaction from afar, gritted her teeth. She couldn't allow Sophia to continue upstaging her. He approached resolutely with a glass in his hand. "Sophia," he said out loud, drawing the attention of those present. "It's amazing how you manage to balance your life, although I have to say it must be a big change for you to be here, right?" Sophia slowly turned to Valeria, maintaining her composure. "Changes are always welcome, Valeria, especially when they allow you to remember what is really important." The comment, although calm, had a weight that did not go unnoticed. Valeria tried to smile, but her discomfort was evident. Alejandro, seeing the tension between the two, finally intervened. "Valeria, I think you should enjoy the party. Sophia is here as my guest and there is no reason for these accusations." Alejandro's public defense surprised everyone, including Sophia. For the first time, he seemed to recognize her behavior, even if implicitly. Valeria looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Of course, Alejandro," he said with a forced smile before walking towards another group. Without saying anything, Sophia took a sip from her glass and continued her conversation with Mendoza. But in his head, he began to realize that that night was not just a game for Alejandro. Something deeper was happening, and although she wasn't looking for it, that change was beginning to reveal itself. At the back of the room, Alejandro, now alone, couldn't take his eyes off Sophia. Everything she had planned for that night fell apart, and in its place an unpleasant reality began to take shape. Maybe Sophia wasn't the only one who had to face her past. Maybe he was the one who needed to change. The night progressed, and with it the tension in the atmosphere became more noticeable. Alexander moved among the guests, but his attention remained on Sophia. From my seat, I watched her shine effortlessly, surrounded by people who seemed captivated by her authenticity. For Alejandro, this was disturbing. I had imagined Sophia tonight as an insignificant figure, but what I saw was a woman who had reinvented herself and who, unlike many in this room, was not seeking validation from anyone. As Alejandro tried to calm down, Valeria approached him again, this time with a more controlled but no less venomous expression. "Alejandro, I don't understand why you allow this to continue happening. Tonight is ours, but it seems that Sophia is getting all the attention." Alejandro looked at her for a moment, taking in the silence between them before responding. "Valeria, Sophia does nothing but be herself. Maybe we should ask ourselves why this affects us so much." The response confused Valeria, but Alejandro had already changed course, leaving his fiancée with a mix of anger and confusion. It was obvious that something was changing inside him, and Valeria knew it. Near the terrace, Sophia enjoyed a moment of peace as she watched the city lights on the horizon. The night breeze cooled her face and gave her a respite from the oppressive luxury of the hall. However, she was not alone for long. Mendoza approached him with his usual courtesy and a drink in his hand. "What do you think of all this?" Mendoza asked, pointing inward. Sophia smiled with a mixture of irony and sincerity. "I find it fascinating to see how people try to fill the void with things that will never be enough." Mendoza nodded, impressed. "You have a refreshing perspective. Alejandro always had a good instinct for surrounding himself with interesting people, but with you I think he underestimated what he had." The comment made Sophia look away for a moment, but she didn't respond. Deep down I knew that Mendoza was right. Alejandro never really understood who she was, and that was the beginning of the end. Back in the room, after several failed attempts to ignore his thoughts, Alejandro decided to face the inevitable. He walked towards the terrace, guided by a mixture of curiosity and need. When he arrived, he found Sophia alone, looking at the city lights. "Can I accompany you?" he asked, breaking the silence. Sophia turned around slowly, surprised by his tone. It wasn't the confident and arrogant Alexander he remembered, but someone else, someone who seemed to be searching for something. "Sure," he responded, without giving too much importance to the topic. They were both silent for a moment, sharing the same vision, although with very different thoughts. Finally, Alejandro spoke. "So you know tonight wasn't what I expected," he admitted, his voice softer than usual. Sofia looked at him from the corner of her eye. "What did you expect, Alejandro?" He hesitated before answering. "I don't know. Maybe I wanted to prove something. You, myself. But now I'm not sure what it was." Sofia nodded slowly, letting his words sink in. "I think you were always trying to prove something, even when we were married. The problem was that you never realized you didn't need it." The sincerity of her words seemed to Alejandro a truth that he had avoided for years. He looked at the horizon, trying to process what he was feeling. For the first time, he realized how much Sofia had changed and how that change made him question himself. "You've changed," he said finally, his voice filled with a mix of admiration and melancholy. "We all change, Alejandro. Some of us do it to get ahead, others just to keep doing what we're doing." There was no rancor in his words, just calm acceptance. Before he could respond, Valeria appeared on the terrace, her expression controlled but visibly irritated. "Should I interrupt something?" he asked with a smile that barely hid his displeasure. Sofia, with her unwavering calm, took a step towards Valeria. "No, not at all. We remember how different everything is now." Valeria stared at her, searching for signs of uncertainty, but found nothing. Alejandro, for his part, remained silent, trapped between two women who represented completely opposite worlds. "Well, Alejandro," Valeria continued, linking her arm with his, "it's time to go back. Our guests are waiting for us." Sofia took advantage of the moment to say goodbye. "I think I should go too. It was an interesting afternoon, but I have work tomorrow morning." Alejandro looked at her with a hint of regret. "Thank you for coming, Sofia." She nodded with a smile that needed no words. As he walked away, Alejandro couldn't help but feel as if something was shaking in his world. For the first time in years, he realized that what he had lost with Sofia was much more than he had ever appreciated. Sofia walked with a firm step through the large main hall of the mansion without looking back. The eyes of several guests followed her movements, but she held her head high, knowing that by accepting this invitation, she had achieved what she set out to do. He has not come to relive the past or confront Alejandro. She was there to prove, especially to herself, that she had overcome everything that had ever made her doubt her own worth. As he waited for his car at the main entrance, a soft night wind caressed his face. He breathed deeply, letting the cool air ease the weight of the night. However, her calm was interrupted by quick footsteps behind her. Alejandro appeared with his tie a little out of place and an expression on his face that he had not shown all night. Vulnerability. "Sofia, wait," he called, stopping a few steps away from her. He turned calmly, although his heart began to beat faster. "What's wrong, Alejandro?" It took him a moment to respond, as if he chose his words carefully. "I couldn't let you go without saying something. Tonight didn't go as expected, but I guess I had to experience it." Sofia raised an eyebrow in fascination. "Do you see what's happening?" Alejandro sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Seeing you like this, so safe, so far from what we once were. I realize I never really understood you, and if I had, maybe things would have been different." Alejandro's words hung in the air for a moment. Sofia looked at him and analyzed his face. There was sincerity in his tone, but it was not enough to undo the past. She wasn't there to apologize or listen to afterthoughts. "It's funny, Alejandro," he responded calmly, "because I spent a lot of time trying to understand you. In the end, I realized that I couldn't tolerate your insecurities or your expectations. That was not my role." The confession was like a soft but firm blow. Alejandro nodded slowly, accepting her truth. "I guess that's what hurts me the most right now. Realizing that you found your way and I'm still stuck in mine." Sofia kept her gaze fixed on him. "It's not too late to change, Alejandro, but you should do this for yourself, not for me or anyone else." Before I could respond, Sofia's car arrived. He opened the door but paused for a moment before entering. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Alejandro, but remember, change is not about impressing others. It's about being honest with yourself." With these words, he got into the car and closed the door. Alejandro remained motionless, watching the vehicle drive away along the illuminated driveway of the mansion. Sofia's words resonated in his head like an echo that he could not ignore. Inside the house, Valeria watched from a window, her almost empty glass of champagne in her hand. When Alejandro returned, she approached him and tried to hide her displeasure behind a forced smile. "What were you doing out there?" he asked in a suspicious tone. "I said goodbye to Sofia," he answered bluntly, with his gaze fixed on a vague point in the room. Valeria stared at him, trying to decipher what was going through his mind. "I hope this hasn't affected you more than necessary. She is no longer part of your life, Alejandro." "Now we are." He turned slowly towards her, his expression serious. "Us?" he repeated, almost as if questioning the word. "Are we really a we, Valeria? Because that night made me realize how much I lived to meet expectations that were not mine." The comment left Valeria frozen. "What are you saying? Sofia made you question everything in one night." "That's not Sofia," Alejandro responded in a firmer tone. "That's what she represents. He found something I don't have. Clarity. And I can't keep pretending I have it all under control when I'm more lost than ever." Valeria tried to respond, but Alejandro raised his hand and stopped her. "I don't expect you to understand, but I need time to process this. Maybe tonight wasn't about Sofia or us, but about facing what I've avoided for years." Without waiting for a response, Alejandro walked away, leaving Valeria alone in the midst of a luxury that could no longer fill the void between them. The music was still playing, the guests were still having fun, but for Alejandro, everything had changed. When Alejandro returned to his room that night, he sat in front of the large window that overlooked the garden. He lit a cigarette, something he only did in moments of great tension. In the silence of the early morning, Sofia's words continued to echo in her head. He knew he couldn't ignore her anymore. This wasn't the ending I planned, but maybe it was the beginning I really needed. Dusk slowly fell on the town. The lights in the garden slowly went out, and the last guest said goodbye amid murmurs and laughter. Alejandro continued to sit in front of the window of his room, watching how the outside world seemed unchanged despite the emotional turmoil that consumed him. The cigarette in his hand was almost completely extinguished, and his mind continued to review Sofia's words. For the first time in a long time, Alejandro felt the weight of his own loneliness. The mansion, with all its luxury and splendor, was nothing more than a golden prison that he had built to impress others. But tonight, those walls couldn't contain the feeling of emptiness that invaded him. In the main hall, Valeria remained with a small group of guests, trying to maintain her perfect hostess facade. But his smile was forced, and his eyes continued to search for Alejandro, waiting for a sign that everything was under control. When the last guest finally left, Valeria walked up the stairs with a determined step and found Alejandro in the room. "Are you going to tell me what's going on?" she asked, crossing her arms as she watched him from the door. "Tonight should have been about us, but you just focused on her." Alejandro did not look away from the window. "It's not about Sofia, Valeria. It's about me, and what I don't want to admit." "What are you saying?" Valeria responded with increasing intensity. "Do you regret being with me? That you still care about her?" Alejandro finally turned to her, his face serious but calm. "It has nothing to do with Sofia, but at the same time it has everything to do with her. It's not about how I feel about her, but what she made clear to me tonight. I spent years building a life based on what I believed and what others expected of me. But now I realize that I have lost sight of what is important." Valeria looked at him in disbelief, as if she didn't recognize the man in front of her. "And what is so important, Alejandro? Because it seems like everything we've built means nothing to you." Alejandro sighed. He was tired of the same answers he had repeated for years. "Valeria, this is not about you. It's not something you can fix or change. It's something I have to face alone. Maybe tonight has brought to light what I have ignored for too long." Valeria shook her head in frustration. "And what do you expect from me? Do you just accept that you're going through an existential crisis because you saw your ex-wife for a few hours? Is that what you want?" Alejandro did not respond immediately. His words were harsh, but they were not far from the truth. Finally, he spoke with a calm that did not correspond to the intensity of the situation. "What I want is clarity, Valeria, and I need time to find it." Valeria was silent for a moment, processing what she had heard. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and left the room, leaving Alejandro alone again. The silence of the early morning grew deeper, and Alejandro looked out the window again. The lights of the last guests' cars faded into the distance, and with them the shadows of what I had previously considered important. Miles away, Sophia lay exhausted but calm in her bed. The night was a reminder of everything he had left behind and how much he had grown since then. But it was also proof that some wounds, although healed, always leave their mark. He looked at the ceiling and allowed his mind to replay the night's conversations. Mendoza and the other guests had shown genuine interest in their work, which made them proud. But what really comforted her beyond that was knowing that she had faced Alejandro without losing her essence. For a moment, her thoughts returned to Alejandro's gaze as he had accompanied her to the entrance of the mansion. There was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Vulnerability, maybe even regret. But it wasn't his responsibility to interpret or correct her feelings. It was a lesson he learned with great difficulty. Finally, he closed his eyes and allowed himself to rest. Tomorrow would be a new day and I had work to do. Life went on, and Sophia knew she was on the right path. Returning to the villa, Alejandro stayed awake and could not find rest. The conversation with Valeria and Sophia's words continued to swirl in his mind, forcing him to face truths that he had avoided for years. Dawn began to appear on the horizon, bathing the town in a soft, cold light. For Alejandro, that morning did not bring answers, but it did bring the certainty that something had to change. He didn't know how or when, but he could no longer ignore the emptiness that had consumed him for so long. The dawn illuminated the large windows of the mansion, but Alejandro had not slept. Every corner of the room, once a symbol of his success, now seemed empty and meaningless. The echo of Sophia's words continued to resonate in her head. Change is not about impressing others. It's about being honest with yourself. It was an unpleasant but necessary reminder. In the main dining room, Valeria was waiting for him with a cup of coffee in her hand, and her face perfectly made up to hide any trace of the previous night's argument. When Alejandro entered, she looked up, but didn't smile. "I thought you'd need this," she said, pushing a cup towards him. "It looks like you haven't slept." Alejandro sat in front of her but did not touch the coffee. "No, I didn't sleep. There are a lot of things I need to process." Valeria placed the cup on the table with more force than necessary. "What now, Alejandro? Do you plan to continue ignoring me while you're lost in thought?" "We didn't plan that." Alejandro looked at her with a tiredness that he could not hide. "Maybe that's the problem, Valeria. Everything in my life is planned, structured, and designed to impress others. But none of that makes me happy. And neither do you. I understand." Valeria looked at him in disbelief. "So what do you suggest? That we're throwing everything overboard because your ex-wife made you doubt everything?" Alexander shook his head. "This has nothing to do with Sophia. It has to do with me. With the person I was, that you know and that I don't even fully understand." The silence that followed was tense but revealing. Valeria knew there was something deeply broken inside Alejandro, something she couldn't fix, even with all the luxury and status they shared. Finally, he stood up from the table with a hardened expression. "Do what you have to do, Alejandro, but don't expect me to keep playing this game if you don't know what you want." She walked away, leaving Alejandro alone with his thoughts again. Meanwhile, in her modest apartment, Sophia was absorbed in her morning routine. He reviewed documents about upcoming community projects, but his thoughts inevitably returned to the night before. Although he had closed an important chapter in his life, he knew that meeting Alejandro and Valeria had awakened feelings that he thought were buried. "Why do you keep thinking about this?" he wondered aloud, shaking his head as if he could dispel the thoughts. But the answer was more complex. It wasn't about nostalgia or regret, but about recognizing how that part of her past had shaped her. At that moment, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Mendoza, the businessman he had spoken to in the villa. "Sophia, I am impressed with your work. I would like to make an appointment to discuss possible financing for your projects. Call me when you have time." Sophia smiled. It was a reminder that their efforts were paying off. The previous night had not been in vain, and if one thing was clear, it was that his present was full of possibilities that he would not have imagined before. Back at the villa, Alejandro went to his office. The room, decorated with luxurious furniture and certificates and awards, now seemed like a mockery of its reality. He turned on his computer and searched for Sofia's profile on social media. What he found left him speechless. Sofia's publications were not pretentious, nor did they aim to impress. They were images of smiling children in makeshift classrooms, of communities working together to create something better. There was a sincerity in each photo that Alejandro hadn't felt in years. He closed the page and leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of his own life crush him. For the first time, he realized that everything he had built was empty because he had built it for others and not for himself. Alejandro made an impulsive decision and dialed a number on his phone. "Patricia, cancel my meetings today," he told his assistant. "I'm going out for a moment. I don't know how long it will take." Before she could answer, Alejandro hung up and left the office. He took his car keys and drove aimlessly, letting himself be guided along the road. Hours later, Alejandro arrived at a small rural school on the outskirts of the city. "I had seen a photo of Sofia in this place, surrounded by children and recycled school supplies. When he got out of the car, he felt out of place in his perfectly pressed suit and designer shoes. He walked to the entrance where a group of children were playing with a worn-out ball. A woman came out to greet him. "Can I help you?" he asked, suspiciously. "I'm looking for Sofia," Alejandro responded. "I'm an old friend." The woman looked at him for a moment, before pointing to a small classroom in the back. Alejandro walked slowly, feeling that each step not only brought him closer to Sofia, but also to something he had lost a long time ago. When he got to the door, he saw her. Sofia stood in front of a blackboard and explained something to a group of attentive children. His expression was relaxed, but full of passion. It was an image that contrasted dramatically with the world to which Alexander belonged, but at the same time, it was a world that seemed strangely familiar to him. Sofia looked up and saw him. Surprise crossed his face for a moment, but was quickly replaced by calm. "Alejandro," he said, leaving the chalk on the table. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here either," he responded with an honesty that surprised him. They were both silent for a moment, knowing that this meeting was no coincidence. Something important was going to happen. Sofia carefully placed the chalk on the table, aware that the group of children were now watching the unexpected exchange between them. Alejandro, still standing in the classroom door, looked out of place in his crisp suit, an obvious contrast to the worn walls and hustle and bustle of the class. However, there was something in his gaze that made him seem vulnerable, as if he was searching for something he had lost long ago. "Children," Sofia said quietly, and turned to her students. "Take a break. Come back in 10 minutes. The little ones trooped out, curious but obedient, leaving Alejandro and Sofia alone in the modest room. "What are you doing here, Alejandro?" Sofia asked, crossing her arms while looking at him suspiciously. Alejandro took a step forward, unsure, something he rarely showed. "I wanted to see you, but not for the reasons you might think. I needed to understand something." Sofia raised an eyebrow and waited for him to continue. "Understand what? How did you manage to keep going?" he responded, sighing. "How did you manage to find meaning and peace, while I'm stuck in a life I don't even know if I want?" Sofia watched him carefully, looking for signs of sincerity in his words. "And what do you expect me to say to you, Alejandro? That there was a magical moment when everything made sense? Because that didn't exist. It was a long process, full of difficult decisions and moments in which I felt lost." Alejandro nodded as if that answer was exactly what he expected. "I guess I was expecting something different, but it makes sense. You were always stronger than me, although I never wanted to admit it." Sofia let out a small, ironic laugh. "It's not about being strong, Alejandro. It's about knowing who you are and accepting what you can't change." That saved me. For a moment, silence filled the classroom. Alejandro looked around the room and noticed the handmade posters, recycled school supplies, and pictures of the children hanging on the walls. There was something incredibly authentic about the whole thing, something that made him question every decision he had made in his own life. Why do you care now? Sophia finally asked, breaking the silence. Your life has always been full of success, full of luxuries. What are you really looking for here, Alejandro? He looked at her, his face a mix of confusion and determination. I don't know for sure, he admitted, but being here and seeing you in this place makes me feel that there is something there that goes beyond everything I have pursued, something I have ignored for too long. Sophia looked down, processing his words. You can't undo the past, Alejandro. You shouldn't try it either. The only thing you can do is decide what you are going to do with what you have now. Alejandro nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. That's why I'm here, because I have to start somewhere. And I thought you could help me understand how. Before Sophia could respond, one of the children ran back into the classroom with a drawing in his hands. Miss Sophia, look what I did, he said enthusiastically, showing a colorful representation of the solar system. Sophia smiled warmly and leaned down to look at the drawing. It's wonderful, Miguel. Do you see how everything has its place and purpose? Like us. The boy smiled before running off again, leaving Alejandro and Sophia in silence again. Alejandro, who had been observing the interaction, seemed surprised by the simplicity and significance of what he had just seen. That's the point, right? He asked, pointing to the classroom. Right now, in these people. Sophia nodded slowly. It is in the impact you have on others, not what you own, that you find true meaning. Sophia's words hit Alejandro with unexpected force. For the first time, he realized how empty his success was and how far he had strayed from what he had once dreamed of. But he also saw an opportunity, a path to something different. I want to help, he said suddenly, his voice full of conviction. I don't know how, but I want to be part of something that really matters. Sophia looked at him cautiously, aware that words did not always translate into actions. It's not something you can decide overnight, Alejandro. It requires commitment, humility, and, above all, patience. I'm willing to try, he responded without hesitation. Not because I hope to redeem myself, but because I think I'm finally ready to face who I really am. Sophia didn't respond immediately, but something in her eyes softened her posture. Perhaps Alexander was not completely lost. Maybe there was a chance for change after all. The silence between them was broken by the sounds of children returning to the classroom. His laughter filled the room with an energy that seemed to relive the moment. Sophia got up, went to the blackboard, and resumed her role as teacher without losing her composure. Alejandro, still standing in the doorway, watched, fascinated by the natural dynamic between her and the students. If you want to stay, you have to work, Sophia said in a light tone without looking at him. There are no spectators here. Alejandro nodded, although he wasn't sure what that meant. He walked to the center of the classroom, where a group of children looked at him with curiosity and a little suspicion. One of them, Miguel, broke the ice by asking, "Are you a friend of Miss Sophia?" Alejandro smiled, but his answer was more honest than I expected. "I used to be. Now I'm here to learn from her, just like you." The children exchanged curious glances before returning to their activities. Sophia didn't say anything, but a slight smile crossed her face as she continued with the lesson. Later, when class ended, Alejandro helped Miguel and other children collect materials from the classroom. Although his movements were clumsy and he was not used to the mess of a rural classroom, he felt surprisingly comfortable. There was something liberating about completing simple tasks and interacting with children without demands or expectations. When the last student said goodbye, Sophia and Alejandro were left alone again. She approached the desk and carefully arranged the papers while he stood there, unsure of what to do next. "I saw something different in you today, Alejandro," she finally said without looking at him. "Maybe you're not as lost as you think." He leaned against one of the tables and crossed his arms. "I don't know if that's a compliment or a warning." Sophia looked at him over her shoulder with an expression that mixed patience and severity. "It's both things. What you did today was a small step, but that doesn't mean everything will change immediately. This requires consistency, and consistency is not your strong suit." Alejandro nodded and accepted her words without arguing. "I know, but I'm willing to try. I can't go on living like before." Sophia left the papers on the desk crossed her arms and looked at him intently. Then start here. If you really want to do something different, come on Saturdays and help with remedial classes. We will see how long your commitment lasts. I'll be here, Alejandro responded with more determination than he had in a long time. That night, Alejandro returned to the villa, but the feeling of emptiness that had haunted him was no longer so present. In its place came a different unease, a mix of nervousness and hope. He went to his office, but instead of turning on his computer to review projects, he grabbed a notebook and started writing. The words flowed with difficulty, but each line was an attempt to reconcile with what he had left behind. He remembered the conversations with Sophia, the lessons he had not learned, and the promises he had broken to himself. Although the process was unpleasant, I felt it was necessary. Valeria was not at home that night. She had decided to stay at a friend's apartment after her fight with Alejandro, which gave her the space she needed to think. In the silence of the village, Alejandro felt, for the first time in years, that he was facing the truth no matter how painful it was. Miles away, Sophia was sitting in her small apartment, discussing plans for the next community project. He thought about Alejandro and what he had seen in him that day. Although there were still doubts, he couldn't deny that something in his attitude had changed. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for him. But Sophia knew she couldn't divert her attention. Her life now had clear meaning, and she could not allow herself to return to the emotional chaos that once defined her relationship with Alejandro. But a part of her that still believed in people's ability to change was willing to give it a chance. He looked at the clock and decided it was time to sleep. When she turned off the light, a feeling of calm came over her. It didn't matter what happened to Alejandro, she was in the right place and did what she had to do. In his villa, Alejandro finally closed the notebook and left the pen on the table. I had written pages of thoughts, but there was still much to clarify. He looked out the window and saw the city lights flickering in the distance. "This is just the beginning," he muttered to himself. For the first time in years, Alejandro felt like he had a goal, although he still didn't know exactly how to achieve it. And deep down, he knew that returning to that little school next Saturday was not only an obligation to Sophia or the children, but also to himself. Saturday came faster than Alejandro expected. He stood in front of the mirror in his room, adjusting a simple shirt he had never thought about before. There was something unusual about his reflection, a mix of nervousness and anticipation. That day marked the beginning of something I still couldn't fully understand, but knew would be different. When he arrived at school, the hustle and bustle of the children already filled the air. Alejandro got out of the car and felt the curious looks of some parents and students. Although his shoes were less elegant than usual, they still stood out in the dirty, concrete surroundings. He took a deep breath before heading to the classroom, where he knew Sophia would be waiting for him. She saw him enter and greeted him with a curt nod. There were no words of greeting, just a gesture that led him to a pile of materials in the corner of the classroom. "We will organize everything for today's lesson. We need the children to work in teams, and I want you to help Miguel and his group with the multiplication tables." Alejandro nodded without complaining or asking questions. He bent down to pick up the materials, feeling a strange sensation of being useful in something so basic but essential. As he organized the papers and explained everything to Miguel and his group, he realized that this small act gave him a satisfaction that his work had never given him. "Mr. Alejandro," Miguel asked while solving a problem, "have you always been good at math?" Alejandro smiled and remembered his youth. "No, not always. It took me a long time to understand them. But the most important thing is not to be the best, but to try hard." The boy nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. Sophia watched discreetly from the other side of the room. Although his expression remained neutral, he felt a small spark of hope within him as he watched Alejandro interact with the children. Maybe he was starting to find his place after all. When class ended, Alejandro helped the children put away the materials and clean the room. Although I was exhausted, there was something rewarding about the controlled chaos of the day. He sat at one of the desks while Sophia reviewed the exercises that the children had presented. "You did well," Sophia said without looking up. "You weren't bad on your first day." Alejandro laughed softly. "Thank you very much for the compliment. It's the nicest thing you've said to me in years." She looked up, a smile barely visible on her lips. "Don't get used to it. This is just the beginning. We will see how long you maintain this enthusiasm." Alejandro looked at her seriously. "I want you to know that I am here because I really want to change, not because I want to impress anyone. I know I have made mistakes, Sophia, but I am trying to change what I can." Sophia studied him for a moment before answering. "Change is not about fixing everything, Alejandro. Sometimes it's just about learning to be different, but that takes time and is not always easy." "I'm willing to try it," he said. She nodded, accepting his answer for the moment. "Then let's go. Kids need someone to show them that they can achieve big things, even if they start small." That night, Alejandro returned to the villa, but this time with a different feeling. The luxury and silence no longer overwhelmed him like before. Instead of getting lost in dark thoughts, he sat down to write in the same notebook he had started days before. She wrote about the children, about Miguel and his questions, about how Sophia faced each challenge with patience and determination. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he had something worth documenting. Valeria had not returned yet. Since their argument, the distance between them had become a silent abyss. Alejandro knew that at some point they would have to deal with what was happening, but for now he preferred to focus on what really mattered. Sophia also reflected on the day in her apartment. As she organized the exercises for the children, she thought about how Alejandro had handled situations with them. Although I still had doubts about his intentions, I couldn't deny that there was something genuine in his attitude. Perhaps he was beginning to understand what it meant to be part of something bigger than oneself. He looked at his watch and put the papers aside. He received an email from Mendoza, the businessman interested in his community projects, confirming a meeting for next week. It was a reminder that their work was growing and that there were opportunities to make an even bigger difference. As he turned off the lights and prepared for bed, an idea occurred to him. Maybe Alejandro could find his way in this world too, as long as he was willing to compromise. In the villa, Alejandro closed his notebook and looked out the window. This afternoon the city lights seemed less distant. Although the path was uncertain, one thing was clear. He could no longer be the man he once was. Now all we had to do was move forward. The morning sun illuminated the rural school and was reflected in the smiling faces of the children as they ran around the playground with their usual energy. Alejandro arrived early, this time wearing even simpler clothes, ready to better integrate into what seemed like a second chance. The greeting was different. I no longer felt the suspicious looks of the children, but instead enthusiastic greetings and laughter that seemed to eliminate all the barriers that previously existed. Sophia stood at the entrance organizing the materials for the day. When she saw him arrive, she looked up with a slight smile. "Punctuality, a good start," he commented, handing her a stack of books. "I learn from the best," Alejandro responded, accepting the books as he followed her to the classroom. The interaction was brief, but characterized by growing camaraderie. During class, Alejandro moved more confidently among the children and helped them with their activities. This time he didn't feel out of place or uncomfortable with his limitations. There was something liberating about focusing on the present, on the small victories of the day. Miguel, his constant companion in these tasks, raised his hand to get his attention. "Mr. Alejandro, can I ask you something?" the boy said curiously. "Of course, Miguel. What do you want to know? Why did you come here? It doesn't seem like you need to be in a school like that." The direct but innocent question left Alejandro speechless for a moment. Sophia, who was listening from the other side of the classroom, listened with interest to his response. "I came because I needed to remember what really matters," he finally said sincerely. "Sometimes when you have a lot of things, you forget what it means to work for something worthwhile. You teach me that." Miguel nodded, satisfied with the answer, while Sophia continued to look at him with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Alejandro changed, not only with words, but with actions that demonstrated true commitment. At the end of the day, as the children ran home, Alejandro and Sophia continued organizing materials in the empty classroom. The atmosphere was calm, but there was a quiet tension that neither of them could ignore. "You're doing a good job," Sophia commented, breaking the silence as she placed the books on a shelf. "I didn't think you'd last this long." Alejandro laughed softly. "Honestly, neither do I. but every day here teaches me something new. It makes me want to be better." Sophia put down the books and turned to look directly at him. "What about everything else? Your life, your commitment to Valeria. How does it all fit together?" Alejandro looked down, knowing that the question was inevitable. "Valeria and we are going down different paths. I knew it a long time ago, but I never had the courage to face it. Now, I know that I cannot continue living in something that is not real." Sophia looked at him for a moment, processing his words. Although he did not say it directly, his confession had an emotional meaning that spoke of a man willing to face his mistakes and accept the consequences. "This place will not improve your life, Alejandro," she finally said, her tone soft but firm. "This is something only you can do, but if you're really here for the right reasons, I think you can find something worthwhile." Alejandro nodded and thanked him for his honesty. "I hope so, Sophia. Because the last thing I want is to continue being the man I was before." That night, Alejandro did not return to the villa. Instead, he stayed in a small hotel near the school, determined to simplify his life while working on himself. He spent hours reviewing his notes, organizing his thoughts, and planning his next steps. For the first time, he didn't feel trapped in a cycle of expectations and appearances. There was a path ahead, although it was still filled with uncertainty. Meanwhile, Sophia was in her apartment, going over the details of her meeting with Mendoza. Although Alejandro occupied his thoughts more than he would like to admit, he knew his focus had to remain on community projects. However, a part of her couldn't help but wonder if this new Alexander would be able to handle the change. He sighed, closed the documents, and allowed himself a few moments to think. The way he interacted with the children, his willingness to listen and learn, gave him hope. But I also knew that real change takes time and constant effort. Days later, Alejandro arrived at the meeting in Mendoza, no longer the confident businessman he once was, but as a humble man willing to learn. Together with Sophia, they presented a plan to expand educational projects in other rural communities. Mendoza was impressed by the clarity and passion of their proposal and agreed to fund the project. This marked the beginning of a collaboration that promised great things. "This is just the beginning," Sophia said as she left the meeting. "I hope you are prepared for the work ahead." "I am," Alejandro responded with a sincere smile. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to try." Sophia looked at him for a moment before answering. "Don't thank me. If you are here, it is because you finally decided to do it yourself." The story of Alejandro and Sophia did not end at that moment. It was the beginning of a long journey full of challenges and learning. Alejandro left behind the superficiality that had characterized his life and focused on building something real, while Sophia continued to lead with the strength and passion that had always distinguished her. They both began to build bridges from different perspectives, toward communities that needed help, toward a meaningful future, and perhaps, in time, toward a new mutual understanding. Life is not measured by what we own, but by the connections we build and the impact we leave on others. This story reminds us that it is never too late to change, redeem ourselves, and find authentic meaning. Now we want to hear from you. What important decision in your life changed your path? Comment below and share this story with those who need inspiration. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. And if this story moved you, stay here and discover another story full of unexpected twists that will touch your heart. Click now and participate in this unique experience.